Good evening.
Hey, Axel!
Hello, Rosemary. I'm the new Gary. Well, I wish. How are you all?
Thank you.
Right, so as you might know, Gary and Pam are overseas, having a whale of a time. And so there's the second guard is trying its best on keeping things ticking over. I hope you enjoyed the newsletter that Rosemary and I put together. And so this week we have Steffan Kraberger with us, and he is a landscape architect. He has got his own design and build company here in Christchurch, and they work with deeply site-based landscapes, and he's going to explain to you what that means. And so last year Steffan wrote his thesis called Port Hills Spatial Planning for Wildfire Management. And so with wildfires going on in California at the moment, things going crazy over there. Our neighbors in Australia having wildfires far too early in the season and really bad ones, and we had our own Port Hills wildfires. I thought, well, that's a good and relevant topic because chances are things are going to get drier and windier, and so we might get more of our share of those things. And so Steffan's done some work on it, and let's welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you. No, not working yet. Is that better?
Something went off.
Better? There we go.
Yeah, you have to be quite close.
Okay, I'll stay. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you, Axel. So to start, I think the site-based aspect is just not a new thing. It's simply that I'm very interested in the history and the layers of a site, and I think that should speak quite strongly with this idea of wildfires and what they mean. So I'll start in on that. So yes, about 3 years ago I started on this thesis, and the backstory to it is quite telling as well, in that Di Lucas and myself talked a bit about this idea of wildfires and what biodiversity and the development of planting, what effect that might be having on fires, and we decided that it would be a good topic, or it was suggested to me that it would be a good topic to put forward, and we did put it forward, and it was declined, and then 2 months later the Port Hill fires happened. So it was, I was maybe the only one that was happy to see that happen. But yes, so Port Hill fires happened, and so there was suddenly a precedent, and everyone jumped on board to make a thesis out of it. And today I'm going to look to sort of spell out the key things that I garnered from that thesis, and I think that there's some really valuable lessons from wildfire, especially around, you'll notice that I called this resilience today, and I think the term resilience is a term that's been quite well tread since the earthquakes, and it's something that we all have certain ideas around, and wildfire puts a bit of a spanner in the works of how we see resilience, and I'd like to talk to that. So this is a wee photo of the Port Hills straight after the fires, and that's up Early Valley Road, and you can see it's quite barren and rough, and it became apparent right from the start that fires are a little bit different from other natural hazards and natural disasters, and that they're cause more apparently of humans. And while we can disregard other earthquakes and other things as being a result of natural powers that are a bit bigger than us, wildfires are quite clearly a result of humans. And the more and more that I'll go into the history of wildfires, it becomes pretty apparent that in New Zealand especially, it's all about humans and how we cause them, and the situations that we create by how we live, and that's really the crux of it. And even if you look at the straight cause of wildfires in New Zealand, there's less than 0.5% of wildfires are reportedly caused by anything other than humans. So it's all humans.
So you make it the whole screen?
Yeah, I can try. I can't guarantee it.
Full screen mode.
Full screen. There we go. Done it?
Yeah.
Lovely.
That's good.
So this is a bit of a busy map, but in its essence what you're looking at is that white line shows the extent of the Port Hill fires, and you can see all the different land covers in there. And I think that that's really critical, and that's what I'll be talking to a lot, is that you've got several dynamics here, and right at the middle here you've got exotic forestry, which is the core. It's Century Pinus radiata right across the Port Hills, and then down the bottom you've got all of our development going up the hill and all of our lovely lifestyle blocks, which I'm sure some of them, including myself, come from.
Can you just talk through the ledgers, Steffan? Because we can't read it. We
The
can't.
layers? Oh yes, yeah. So I can't really read it myself, but up there I'm a bit colourblind as well, so you have to bear with me. But suburban extent and lifestyle land use is the second one down, and then rural land use is the yellow. Parks reserves is the green, and then the dotted lines are access network, the solid lines are roads, and the red is the exotic forestry, and this dashed overlay is where it's regeneration at the top. Hold that for a moment longer if anyone wants. Pass on it. So the way I approached this wildfire problem is, I'm not a scientist, and there's plenty of wonderful work going on at University of Canterbury Forestry Department around the science of fires, and there's a really validated whole field around fires, but my interest wasn't lying with that. It was what we do as humans to cause fires and how that can affect how we understand natural hazards. And so I delved into the history of the Port Hills and our history of fire in the Port Hills, and what became really clear really quickly was that in the Port Hills we just have a history of reoccurring fires, and essentially it's a composition, a land composition that just causes what we see. And I mean, it's a little bit forward thinking, but essentially it's going to happen again when you look at the Port Hills. And these arrows through here are ranging right through from 1840 right through to present, and are all bushfires as recorded that have happened on the Port Hills. Just every 25-30 years there's a significant bushfire or fire on the Port Hills in this dotted lines, that area. So you can see that it's just a recurring trend, and it's not just a one-off natural hazard that we can walk away from. So without going into too much depth, I'd like to just talk to what wildfire is, and I think it's really important to understand how complex anything like this can be, and that there's different ways that feed into what we understand as wildfire threat. So wildfire threat has three components. You got risk, hazard and values. And so the risk is the likelihood essentially of something happening, of a car driving past like a dry paddock, and then it's essentially a cause. And then you've got the hazard, which is essentially the areas that are going to perpetuate the fire. And so large areas of bush, they're going to perpetuate it if it's standing half dead, Pinus radiata. And then the values are things that are going to get affected by it. And these are all concepts that have really been developed in Australia, where it's more of a day-to-day issue. But the underlying principle is that in New Zealand we have an ever-increasing risk and an ever-increasing hazard and an ever-increasing value And so as climate change is affecting it, we're getting warmer and warmer, and the likelihood of them happening is going up because everything's drier and there's more and more fuel out there, and so the hazard's going up. And then at the same time, our values are going up and up. And one of the key principles that we're finding around cities is that we're expanding and we're pushing out and encroaching on our rural land, and we're pushing our values out into these little tendrils. And if you look at the Port Hills, you can see we extend out all of the spurs. We create these environments where our values are pushed out, and so is the risk of fires occurring. And the other big thing that's quite hard to hear, or it was for me at least, is that lifestyle blocks and those areas where we're taking over what was rural land and what was highly managed land and breaking it up into 8-acre lots. That's where we're under-managing land, and that's where we're creating huge environments of under-managed fuel, essentially, and lifestyle livers are a big cause of that. So the other idea, so when you take wildfire risk, which is over here on the left here, and then you have to manage, so if you're looking to manage wildfire, you have to go like long term before, which is thinking about how do we prevent it occurring, straight before it, which is readiness, you know it's going to occur, and think of like mid-February, March, when you've got that direct, it's going to happen. And then you've got response, which is firemen, essentially, and all of their attachments. And then after, which is the recovery. So not only is there multiple components that cause fires and play into how they affect us, but there's also a time component of how we can deal with it. So it gets quite convoluted. And then within that as well, we've got different ways that we can deal with managing it, and that's through land development. And I'll read those. The key part of this is actually just social development, land development, and spatial planning. So the key ones there are that social development means understanding what wildfire is, and in New Zealand we don't really understand, especially not now, what wildfire is. The interesting thing is that that's actually been lost. We used to have that in New Zealand, and a really good example is periwinkle. We'd see periwinkle as quite a ongoing pest for most people, and a lot of people spend a lot of effort and money to get rid of periwinkle. And originally the intention of that was to bring periwinkle around to swathe and essentially skirt our large homesteads as a fire resistant, not so much only to save our houses, but also they recognised that the cause of fires were humans, and that if a house was going to light, which was quite a common occurrence back in the 19th century, that you wanted to stop it spreading onto your ground and onto your land and ruining your lifestyle.
What is periwinkle?
Periwinkle is a small, leafy, creeping weed.
It's a myrtle.
There we go, it's a myrtle. Fantastic.
And why does that protect?
Why does it? Because it's got a leafy, glossy leaf with a lot of water retention in it, and it's also essentially quite a smothering, so it covers over. You imagine like grass, it will actually cover over it and create a constant wet, broad foliage over it, which stops. If you've got a spark, if you threw a cigarette into periwinkle as opposed to throwing it into a dry grass field, it would be less of a likelihood of continuing.
Just you terrible.
This little diagram is probably unimportant, and again it's a little bit overcomplicated, but the key message that's getting stated here is that in New Zealand, how we deal with fires is that we don't really live with them, we don't understand them like they do in, say, California, or even more so in Australia. They understand that that's a yearly event and that's part of their cycle, and they deal with it on an ongoing basis, and they deal with the reality of it. In New Zealand, our social understanding of fire is pretty limited. It is there, but it's pretty limited. And at the moment, what's happening is we're slowly bringing that up, and there's a huge amount of really good work to bring up that social understanding. At the same time, the other big thing that we do is we respond to fires. We're really good at responding to fires and pushing men into it, and there's a lot of wonderful volunteer work that New Zealanders seem to love to jump into, and there is a hugely effective fuel management and fire response emergency management service in New Zealand. So it's not to belittle those, but it's just to look at it as three components of what we're covering. And essentially, if you look at it, land management we're doing reasonably well. We're enforcing that people do deal with dry paddocks in some degree, and then social development we're improving, and then spatial planning and thinking about where we're putting things and how we're living and where we're placing our houses and how we're expanding our cities, there's essentially none. So that's sort of the crux of, it's a little bit early. So again, jumping back. Oh yeah. So jumping back a little bit, now you understand what wildfires are caused by. If you look at the trends of how fires have happened in the past on the Port Hills, this is Cashmere, which is by far our earliest suburb that extended up onto the Port Hills, and by far the earliest pine plantation was up the top of Cashmere. And so, I mean, it's not scientific, but you can see this little cluster here of where these arrows start, and that's essentially showing that a heap of those fires just started on Cashmere. And as we've extended essentially urbanisation of the Port Hills, they've spread out to different spots across the Port Hills. It's a pretty clear pattern that where urbanisation and our suburban development happens onto the hills, that's where it spreads.
How often? How many years?
How many years split? Sort of 20 to 50 years.
20.
Yeah, and if you, yeah, and that's Port Hills, and then if you throw Banks Peninsula and the plains into the mix, it tightens up a little bit. That being said as well, the records of fires are pretty sparse, and I had to really like search through, I'd figure out what a microfish was. I do now, but yeah, it's quite long.
A lot of whitefish.
Yeah. So yeah, there was limited, but there's of papers past, there was a little bit, and there was some records, but in terms of New Zealand Fire Service, they do have some records, but it's pretty limited, so we don't actually know. Yeah. This little map I just made to show the development of fires over the years. So I did like a long form, so that's going 12 million years back. It's quite far. And then through to early Māori and intensive burning period, which is sometimes touted as being a high amount of burning, but if you compare the growth and the development of fires over time, it's actually increasing, and we're really hitting this. It's pretty clear.
Is that in terms of area or frequency or what?
Area and frequency, yeah, and record of them as well, which increases over time as well. On that note of 13th century Māori understanding of fire as well, they had similar to early colonisation, a pretty close relationship with fire, and treated it as much as a day-to-day necessity as well as a risk, and they understood the risk of it. And even with those broad sort of hunter-collector style burnings, it was quite a controlled and considered activity, and they knew how it affected their lives and how it was human caused. So this, again, that's a little bit more of a simple map of the Port Hill fires extent and the extent of land cover. So you can see here again the red popping out in exotic forestry and a little bit of the yellow in the grasslands. So to understand the land cover relationship with fire on the Port Hills, basically you've got a huge amount of standing pine forest, which is a problem all around, especially Banks Peninsula, where you've got what happened from the 70s, where pine forest was really intensified and also really encouraged, and then in these areas where it's marginal ground, marginal access, the silviculture has been really low and the condition of those pine forests are really low. And so you've got dense forest with a massive amount of side branch, and it's scrappy, and there's scrap underneath it, and it's essentially beautiful fuel. And then beside that, you've got these bands of pasture land, and as we know, farm, especially on steep properties like the Port Hills, is becoming more and more marginalised, and so that economy drive down means that those marginal areas of farmland are becoming more and more under-maintained, and so that combination is really tightly related. And I think in terms of how we see farming, we've really got to play into that, and that's where revegetation starts to come hand to hand, is that with the marginalisation of farming and pasture land, that we've got to look at how we use and what we reuse those properties for. So jumping back to the Port Hill fires, this is all burnt, so this whole area from Victoria Park right through, and you've got Burleigh Valley down in there, that's all burnt. And when I was doing my thesis, the questions were coming up alongside it of what's going to be done in response, and so that response is what I was, I guess, critiquing, and the critique was pretty harsh in that the response immediately was to reseed Port Hills, which was understandable in some sense, that they wanted to stabilise it and not let it rush into our aquifer system. And so I could understand why that was done, but it also meant we got pasture straight back on the Port Hills. And now there's moves as well, and there has been moves to essentially allow all that exotic forestry to go in as built. So it's kind of reinstatement approach back to the Port Hills. And so the opportunity to essentially better the way we use the Port Hills and the risk it presents to our city is completely, at this point, being underutilised. At the same time, we've had continued development of our suburbia up on the base of the Port Hills, and Cashmere Estate development, which is down in here. It's not actually on Cashmere, but that's pushing up on the hills. And if you drive along Old Taitap Road, you can see more and more so that band of lifestyle / suburbia is just extending up onto the hills and along the hills further and further, and creating more and more of this issue. And especially as we see pine forests coming back, it's going to be an issue. And this little diagram is kind of showing the expansion patterns under sort of, if you just let it go as it's currently moving. You've got this massive body of exotic forestry that's going to look to be reinstated, and you've got a trend of it just pulling across the Port Hills further and further. And that's the wee trend of suburban residential. So you can see how those, that's the UDS 2014 urban limit. So that's what contains it. And you can see how it's just stretching up further and further. And there's absolutely a planning allowance for us to stretch further up onto the Port Hills. Same around Governor's Bay to some extent. You can see there's a little bit there. Governor's Bay was quite lucky to get away with it with the Port Hill fires, but you can see even the top properties were quite threatened, and there's definitely capacity for Governor's Bay to push up onto that hillside. And the same with, that's the last one with lifestyle residential properties. And pastoral properties. So this is just a, well, not hypothetical, it is somewhat justified, but it's a look at where the critical areas are around our urban expansion edge. And this is just like a buffer zones. It's rather complicated map, but the key message from this is those areas around our urban edge essentially need to be what they're doing or looking to do in Australia, is rather than create an environment where you've got all of these little fingers coming out and a really long sensitive urban edge. They're looking to do what's a wee bit grotesque in some ways from an urban design perspective, but create a straight, flat edge and then buffer that edge. So if you're looking here, rather than having multiple wings, they're looking to simplify their urban edge and create quite a strong boundary and then buffer that. So this is just an exploration of what that might look like on the Port Hills. And the other thing that is a big opportunity on the Port Hills is our roadside edges, which luckily on the Port Hills we've got the Summit Road, we've got the Summit Road Society, which is a massive amount of potential area which is being developed for biodiversity mainly, but there's also a buffer for that Summit Road because vehicles are one of our biggest causes of wildfires. So if where we're allowing vehicles is essentially where we're allowing risk, and our sort of buffer on our roads is how we need to deal with that risk, or at least is a really good way we should deal with that. Past that.
So what's the buffer? What's in the buffer?
What's in the buffer? I'll just get to that in 2 seconds. Yeah.
You're listening.
So this, very well, exactly. This is a little something I found up in Able Tasman, actually, which is surprisingly they were doing work. Department of Conservation, I think, was doing work to restore the Anchorage dunes and reduce fire risk there as well, which is they're looking to essentially they look at their public access of all the walking tracks as being the highest risk point, which I think is pretty justified, and looking to buffer that from the rest of the national park. So that's quite a strong example and was quite surprising to see out there. There's a photo of just a pretty stock standard road edge, but it's actually been quite well composed with harakiki in terms of if we're looking at fuels, any fuel is going to be a problem for fire. It's one of those problems where there's not a complete answer. You can't just create a barren environment alongside our roads where nothing's going to light. It's just going to be horrendous. So it's about the best of what we can do, and luckily for us, natives actually can fill that out to some extent. So one of the key principles from that is just broadleaf foliage. If you think about your different types of plants, things with a broad glossy leaf essentially are less likely to burn, and there's some great work done by Tim Curran at University of Canterbury, and he goes around with a barbecue at Lincoln, sorry, he's at Lincoln, thank you, and he goes around with a barbecue and puts different leaves in it. It's quite exciting, and they burn at different rates, and it's quite incredible watching it. And if you put in, say, like broom or gorse, which are also ironically the ones that respond first and bounce back from fires, they're also the ones that burn quickest and hottest. And then if you put something in there like Griselinia, like actual broadleaf or harakiki, they're really low. And one of it's called whiteywood, Melicitis randiflorus, so that is a really common plant that essentially is kind of the golden child of the bounce back of the Port Hills. And I'll show you this lovely little diagram that's done by Anna Texiera, and she essentially did a heap of research after the Port Hill fires and followed what bounced back the best of our natives, and you can see, well, there's also non-natives in there, but gorse is just below it, but Melicitis randiflorus, which is kind of a often underutilised, it's not often planted and sometimes a little bit belittled, is way up there and super effective, and it's also really good for essentially keeping fires from happening.
So super effective in repopulating after a fire.
Exactly, right. So both, yeah, there's different. And Tim Curran again at Lincoln proposed that idea, going back to that buffer idea of a green belt, and it's kind of an old idea that's been touted about the Port Hills for a long time and about Christchurch and Greenwell, that green belt idea, but this adds another spin to it. But that idea of a green belt that buffers the Port Hills, which you could say is the fuel and the risk from the city itself. And that's where the real issue of the Port Hill fires came, is that fires happen naturally and they do occur, and that's just go a little bit back into what causes fires. This is big dynamic behind the Californian wildfires, but essentially when you are that good at firefighting that you stop fires happening, you allow fuel to build up over time. So if we're looking at a 50-60 year period, we've become that good at stopping fires that the fuels are building up and densifying over time, that when they do happen, they happen at a much bigger scale than they would have if they'd just done a natural cycle. And in New Zealand we don't have a particularly fire adapted vegetation, which is generally where that dynamic happens, but we still have this thing happening where fires haven't happened for a long time in that scale. When they are happening, they're just going through 30 years of established pine forest and going straight into our suburbs. So that's why we need to look at other planting.
Do you mind reading the list?
Yeah, sure.
Read it.
So
Common name.
Whitewood at the top, testing. Mahui at the top, Whitewood. And then you've got gorse below that. You can check me this, Colin. And then you got five finger under that. I'm guessing that's going to be robusta, would be a type of carnuka. Then you've got Pittosporum tenuifolium, so lemonwood, and then Coprosma robusta and lucida, and that's like your standard coprosmas, but the really glossy leaved ones. Then you've got Cordyline australis, so that's just your cabbage tree, which the bounce back and the resprouting was quite amazing across the Port Hills. I'm not sure on elderberry. Under Hebe salicifolia, so that's our local Hebe. Kodamiko. Olearia avicennifolia, so that's I'm not sure on its common name.
Daisy shrub.
Daisy shrub, there we go. Ribbonwood, Chrysalinia, so broadleaf, and then at the bottom you've got our lovely local tree fuchsia.
Nailed it.
And that's the wee list of them again, seeing the in the same order, but the native exotics, kind of interesting. So in terms of natives, we've got quite a palette on our hands to use, but we do need to consider how we're going to use it. And carnuka is probably a bit of a challenging one in that it is quite a highly flammable plant, and it's got all those wonderful oils that we all love, but they also cause issues with fire. And if you're thinking about your lifestyle blocks, and they all contribute to the problem, and so how we're planting them, the density, the distance away from our house, and if you're thinking about your property on that same principle of the city, you need to think in the same way. Or if you're wanting to consider fire, about a buffer from your house, and then a buffer, say, from your road, and it's always lovely having a driveway that's overhung, but that can cause a lot of issues, and those that risk of a fire is often thought about in a rather insular way on your own property. But I think the lesson from the Port Hills is that every fire that's caused is actually everyone's problem, and you're causing the whole Port Hills to eventually light. So you protecting your house and your surroundings from fire isn't about you, it's about the whole Christchurch and Port Hills. And especially with lifestyle being one of the biggest causes of fires and perpetuators of fires in New Zealand, lifestyle blocks. And the other dynamic of lifestyle blocks is that sometimes we live in a rural environment without a thorough rural understanding, and the way we maintain and manage our lives in a rural environment. The definition of lifestyle is that you don't live on your property, and I think that means you're often out of touch to some extent, maybe as a farmer, and lose those little loose edges around the corners of your property, and they'll let go. And at the same time, it brings to mind that dynamic, which is for good reason a really good trend, which is the succession method of revegetation, which is what Hugh Wilson is figureheading over on the Port Hills, and that's fencing off our properties and letting them develop. And if we're looking at programs like the Billion Trees program, and all our nurseries at the moment, which are completely overrun, we're really encouraging revegetation, and we're a wee bit overrun by the amount of money and the disconnect between supplying plants. And so increasingly that financial incentive is behind succession method approach to revegetation, and it seems to be exceedingly effective as well. But in terms of wildfire, succession revegetation is quick. So when you get past that 20-year mark where you've got a beautiful lush green canopy with some of these lovely hebes and all sorts, then you've got a real asset and you've got your green belt. But in between there, when you've got scrubby, overgrown, lots of gorse, exactly, that we're using as our nursery plants, that's a huge fire issue. And that's not necessarily a problem in of itself that we need to stop succession method, but we need to consider it and consider how we buffer it. And when we're doing that approach to succession method where we clear the edges and stop gorse from extending out from those edges, we need to think about how we're buffering what we're doing there for 20 years, because we're creating a high risk environment for 20 years essentially. These were just some final points, and I think I talked through the first one. So these are just sort of bigger dynamics that I think wildfire should play a part in. Second one's farm planning and diversification of farmland. So as it's becoming increasingly necessary from a policy perspective, from a policy enforcement, to change our farms and the way we farm, we need to think about wildfire and how we can use our farmland to do that and to buffer it. And as we're diversifying farmland, people are reaching out and trying to figure out how they can earn other types of income, and carbon crediting is one of the big ones there. And so what we plant, we are going to plant, and what we plant is important. Forestry development and billion tree program is kind of a big issue at the moment in terms of this huge amount of money and the potential for a huge amount of increased forestry and pine forestry, and that monoculture forestry is a huge issue for wildfire. And that dynamic of carbon crediting and meeting our Paris goals is forcing more and more forestry in New Zealand. And one of the key issues is that any forestry where we have to actually take it down and use it is essentially perpetuating the growth of more forest. So if we're wanting to, on the long form, reach our carbon credit goals, then every time we plant a forest and then we go and gather it for wood, we actually have to extend the forestry to compensate for that as well. And that's been, it's not really out there, but that's something that's been quite well substantiated at the moment. And so all of those really well-intentioned high-level forces are potentially causing some really difficult issues on the ground. That's especially the Billion Tree program. And the incentivised planting is sort of fits into the same thing, in that more and more so in our lifestyle blocks. If you look at Mocha Carrara, they're encouraging planting, and everyone's encouraged by planting. So we need to think while we're doing it, and that just comes back to that lifestyle. You can make a difference in this, the attitude. And then the last part is suburban expansion, and that goes in play with also traffic and access and public access, which is a little bit at ends with every time we open up public access, we're also opening up risk. So that needs to be a consideration, and the same with vehicles. We're opening up access, and we need to consider that risk.
What about beech trees?
Beech trees as a risk? I'm not sure where they sit on the scale. I'd love to look it up, but I don't know where they sit. But I know that they've been pretty badly burnt up in the other fires that happened a year ago.
Nelson.
Nelson as well, yeah, Nelson fires, exactly. And there were some more at Arthur's Pass that were pretty effective on the beech trees, but I don't know how resilient they are.
Good.
Any other questions?
Right. Fascinating. Who's got questions? I see Chrissy's hand.
Excellent. Mine's a technical one, not a political one, which is a change.
What's wrong with you?
Eh?
What's wrong with you?
One thing you haven't talked about, Steffan, is on a lot of the public land that's open grassland. It used to be managed by grazing, and originally cattle and then sheep. And there seems to be a trend that that public land has been destocked.
Yeah.
So can you just talk about the rank grass, and is using animals as a management method something that we should be really considering?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Grazing is a key management practice, definitely. And it's a low risk one as well, because if we fly around it with a mower, that's just another spark to some extent that's out there, whereas fire, an animal's pretty low risk, and it's those expanses that are really the issue. And I think a good example as well is just the tension of that trend as well. It goes the same with, say, goats, for example, which would keep pasture down on those hard to get to areas, and with the culling of goats, that's just allowed those edges to, which has also allowed the natives to come back. But in terms of the public areas and the lower maintenance on them, absolutely that's contributing to it, and it's a dynamic which is causing more and more risk, having public land with long unmaintained grass, definitely.
Mine's just a quick follow-on, Steffan, I'm Sophia, from Chrissy's, because I just was going to more or less ask the same question, because I live on Monk's Spur, and I walk up daily above there, and there's rank grass everywhere, and my issue is partly that the areas, again, aren't being regularly grazed, but the areas that have got regenerating bush or old stands of bush aren't fenced off, and so this is city council land, and so this is one of the issues that I think we need to start bringing to the city council's attention, that they need to protect those little bits of bush that are still there with fences, so that we've got at least some areas that are a buffer and a seed source.
Absolutely, and a fence as well, I think, is one of the best approaches to draw your line around what your different risks are, and then you can maintain them in the right way. You don't want to have to graze under forest. It's going to stop all the succession, and I think the fence means that you can manage them in their appropriate ways for their different risks. And
hi, Steffan.
Yeah.
I just wonder what is the rationale for returning pine forests to the Port Hills. As I remember, some 30 years ago, when Di and I were on regional council, there was a big move to, some of these farms were uneconomic, and there was going to be livestock blocks. There was actually a campaign to get a regional park across the Port Hills. But the recognition of how serious it was to convert to forestry was really brought up in the Environment Court. I can't remember whether Di was actually an expert witness at that stage, or whether she's still in council, but they looked at the economics of it over time, and it was a shock to me to actually see that within a few decades you had negative productivity because of the risk of fire. It was a very serious risk, some 20 or 30 years ago. So why is this not recognised now?
I think the recognition of the fire risk is the same reaction a little bit that I got it's a problem that people, I think, especially policymakers, struggle to see as an ongoing issue, fire, and that it's a one-off. It's still viewed as a one-off, and even when considering it from an economic perspective as a likelihood, it's still viewed as a natural hazard which could possibly happen but probably won't, and so it's discarded essentially. And I think that's the absolute underlying message, is that it will happen, and maybe you might get away with your forestry block not getting burnt down, but the reality is it's a high likelihood.
So
And
what's the rationale, considering the poor quality of wood that gets out of it, the difficulty to sort culture, etc., etc.? Why? What is it? Is it climate change, carbon sequestration? What is the rationale?
on the Port Hills, it's owned by a forestry company, and they're looking to reinstate their investment, essentially. In other areas, the pine forest is being driven by, like you say, the carbon sequestration, but there's plenty of evidence to show that it isn't a very good sequester because it has to be harboured, and that cuts it all out, and we'll run out of space eventually to keep on doing that. So there isn't a sound incentive. There's a short-term incentive and a short-term, unfounded maybe, incentive for forestry, but yeah, and the original forestry that got burnt on the Port Hills was a lot of it, that 30-40 year old forestry was half and half financed as well. So at that point, when it was low cost and you had the government fronting up the other half of it, the financial incentive was just that much higher. Nowadays, I think it's a little bit blind.
Was it also driven by insurance?
Hang on. Colin.
Is the reinstatement also driven by insurance?
We use the microphone. You get your turn.
Maybe that question was about how insurable those forests are, which is a thought that came to my mind in that discussion. Come back to that. But what I was interested to know is whether you've got any information on the proportion of arson in causation of this fire, and the more tricky and complicated question of how society might address this risk.
Absolutely. Arson is a big problem in New Zealand. It's not sure how big the problem, and if you look at the fire records, it's often got arson with a question mark beside it, and it's possibly an issue that if you look at the likelihood that this was caused by arson, the top fire at least, which it seems exceedingly likely, and it seems exceedingly likely that the bottom one had some part to play with utility services as well, although that didn't eventuate, but it seems like it did come from a power line to some extent, or it certainly played into it. And the top one being arson though, again, if you look at that consideration from a social perspective, I think we don't understand the consequence of arson. Just a year prior to the Port Hill fires, the 2017 ones and 2016, there was 2 fires on the top there caused by fireworks, which is an intentional arson, but it's haphazardous use of fireworks, and I think just generally there's probably not enough consequence or not enough social conscience or social understanding of what the repercussions of fire is, because we don't live with it. We don't see those big fires as there is in other places. One thing we don't have is that overseas or especially Australia, there's some incentives for arson around payment of volunteer firefighters, which is quite a big dynamic over there. We don't tend to have that, so it's true arson in New Zealand.
What do you mean?
People who you get paid for volunteering for fire services.
So you set a fire and then...
Yeah. And that dynamic has happened quite a lot. It is a dynamic, absolutely, but in New Zealand it's true arson. And again, it comes down to that social, that sort of fire-wise is still, it's a short-term understanding of fire, it's a seasonal understanding of fire, it's a natural hazard understanding of fire, rather than a truly imbued understanding that we cause it, and your arson is going to cause massive effects, and it's hard to control, and where you're starting it. And even up there, I'm not sure of the outcome of the arson, but they certainly didn't track down who did it. But I'm not sure on that. It ended up quite far after my thesis where that got to, but they did sum it up by saying they believe the top is arson, and it happens quite a lot in New Zealand, and we don't understand it. That's a good question. We don't understand fire and the repercussions of it. Arson.
I think one of the issues that we have is that we kind of rely on the market to deal with things, rather than governance and planning. And it struck me quite a while ago when I was in an area that was a lot of forestry, some people were actually grazing under planting forestry and actually saying, oh well, we can graze under it to keep the fire risk down. I mean, presumably there are ways that we could actually legislate to manage these, and I'm wondering whether you've had conversations with council, for instance, or ECAT about planning in regard to this, and the fire brigade for that.
I haven't, and I'd like to.
I hope so, because I suspect there are some management techniques that they could legislate for.
Absolutely, and and I think that there's management techniques that could be legislated, and there's planning considerations that could be legislated. We don't need to put a textbook obligation of fire on areas, but we do need to obligate that that's at least considered and understood to some extent, because like I said, Lincoln and University of Canterbury have an amazing network of fire scientists that understand the dynamics and the workings of fire. And my role was more, or my viewed role was more about the implications of land management and people and planning. But if those policymakers were to reach out, it's not as if there's not answers there, and it's not as if there's not methods there that are well substantiated and well practiced overseas.
I understand, by the way, that the new fire machine, whatever it's called, they have some responsibility for risk management.
Yeah, they do.
Now, and so I'm wondering if but they can't do planning stuff. But somebody rang me at the office and said there's a problem with rank glass up there that's going to be a fire hazard. Then apparently who you ring is the fire service now.
Yeah, FENS has really taken on, and I might just skip back a few, just to talk to, when you're talking about, there we go, that diagram where you're talking about those stages.
Yeah.
FENS has taken great ownership over that component of saying that readiness, and if something's appearing to be in a high fire season a threat, then they'll take care of it, and they're kind of looking at that readiness of being, a year ahead of things and keeping some form of maintenance, and their response has been really consolidated, and there were massive moves from the Port Hills about bettering the response. But FENS has done it, and it's a bit, essentially it hasn't been outspoken, and it was in the response, so there was a document set up about what needs to be done in response to the Port Hills, and in those was a long-term planning goal that it needs to be considered, but there were no real.
And they don't have any power to enforce that on private landowners.
No, I mean there is power to some extent to obligate you to, in high risk season, say to mow your paddock that you've left on a roadside edge, and that you have to take care of that. And you see that more on areas like the peninsula than you see that in sort of semi-suburban areas. But there is those powers there.
Thank you.
As an ex-hill dweller, after the fires, it was at a number of meetings that I went to, they said that they're actually sourcing fire retardant pine trees. Is there such a thing?
Fire retardant pine trees. I haven't heard of that.
Definitely fire retardant pine trees.
I haven't heard of it, I'm sorry. I'm fascinated though, I'll be looking it up.
Right. 2 more questions.
It's not plastic Christmas trees, is it?
Steffan, the Californian LA fires, I mean, they are an annual thing. Are they always arson?
What, are they
always arson?
Are they always arson?
Yes, caused by arson.
I'm not sure about the cause exactly of them, but I would doubt it, given the likelihood of fires being caused by vehicles. I mean, in New Zealand, our biggest cause is by far vehicles. And by vehicles, that also somewhat counts in someone throwing a cigarette butt from their vehicle. But if we had I can't tell you definitively whether they're always caused by arson, but I would say by those statistics of the likelihood of vehicles causing it, I'd say a vehicle would very likely cause it before an arson.
So they don't develop any plans for prevention?
In America? Yeah, in California there's a really strong long-term approach to, and it's considered in everything from development and expansion of cities and areas which they're expanding into, and they've got a really close relationship between this wonderful approaches to risk mapping, which there are now. There's these beautifully detailed and nuanced risk mapping approaches which take into account like all of those headings that I was talking about, values and threats and land cover. So that mapping's there, and it's actually been done for New Zealand as well. But they take those layers and they consider them into planning, and you have to make your case just like when you're putting through a consent. That's a consideration that's built into the system there, that you have to justify yourself for making more risk or for an adverse effect essentially on that. Yeah.
Kia ora, Steffan. Notwithstanding your thesis was on the Port Hill fires, just wondering what you, how you might be able to generalise or apply some of your thinking and thoughts around some of the exotics on the flatland, so around here, so thinking say McLean's Island and in particular Bottled Lake.
Yeah.
And what your thoughts might be on that for the long term and how you might deal with that threat, if you like.
Yeah, I think flatland fires are and have been a big risk in Canterbury as well, and there's been plenty of big flatland fires as well. They don't move quite as quickly as hill fires just because of that dynamic of a fire going up a hill. It moves, but it doesn't. The same principle applies in terms of how we're layering up fuels and causes of fuels and values. And if you're looking at McLean's Island and the way that we're introducing public access is a good overlay there. It's again an example of how we're letting people in, and that's causing a match-up of two factors which causes fires. And the same with suburban development into the plains and how we're pushing that. That's causing more and more people to live in a semi-rural environment around areas like McLean's Island with big forestry that don't necessarily understand the risks of their life in that sort of fuel environment. Yeah. So it's directly applicable in terms of that same logic that's on the Port Hills. It's probably not quite as quick moving, and the same with when they did nationwide mapping of New Zealand, the Port Hills and Nelson Hills were both identified as one of the highest risks back in 2014 or 15. So that awareness was already there, but flatland is pretty close behind as well. Yeah. Hope that answers it.
Hi Steffan, my name's Julie. Just more of a comment really than a question. When you talk about carbon sequestration and the Billion Trees project, and I understand much of it is going to be pine, or is pine, And it really concerns me when I look at Canada's boreal forests, which are basically pine species, which have not net sequestered carbon since 2001. They've actually been net emitters of carbon dioxide because of fire, because they're burning. And it just seems really misguided to me to go planting pine forests as a method of sequestration of CO2. And stupid really. And I just really hope that the government, and particularly New Zealand First and Shane Jones, is aware of your research and others like you in that regard.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I appreciate the strong word as well. Being younger, I'm often a bit tentative about having the strong word of it and rely on the kind of carbon cycle as being the stupid part of it, but I think the fire makes it just as ill thought through as well.
So I had said only 2 more questions, and that was 3, but I didn't think it was going to be wise me going past my wife's hand going up. Wouldn't it be worth my while? What an interesting thesis that has been, eh? And so what have I learned from this? There's a lot of good planning that happens. There's a lot of knowledge that we have. Do we apply it? No. What's driving the show? Short-term gain? I don't know. It really worries me, but it seems to be a common theme. So it's not Steffan's fault. Of course, fascinating talk. Really enjoyed that. Learned a lot of stuff covered that I had no idea about. I shall look at periwinkle with very different eyes from now on in. So please join me in thanking our guest speaker.
Next week we have Jean Drage coming to talk about the elections. Jean Drage's lectures at Lincoln. Sorry, wrong one. They're all the same to me. Anyway, so she'll be here next week talking about elections and local government. Thank you very much. And if anybody wants to see what a periwinkle is, Chrissy's got it on her phone.